Academic parapsychology approaches the unknown much differently than popular culture. It relies on tight controls, blinding, and the strict isolation of invisible variables. When applied to the concept of the afterlife, it functions as an active, empirical probe into the underlying architecture of human consciousness itself. In scientific terms, this field is defined by the survival hypothesis. Stripped entirely of religious doctrine, it asks a single testable premise. Does a disembodied consciousness, or some non-physical element of human personality, persist after the death of the biological body? To see why establishing the facts of this phenomenon is crucial, look at the scale of public demand. This chart from IBISWorld shows the psychic services industry generates around $2 billion annually in the United States alone. A massive portion of that revenue is driven by mediumship and afterlife communication. This intense economic demand points directly to tarot management theory, the psychological premise that humans suffer a baseline, universal anxiety caused by the unyielding awareness of our own mortality. This graph illustrates how that anxiety distributes across a population. Death anxiety is low for the highly devout and strict atheists. It spikes highest among those in the middle. Survival research targets that exact demographic, offering empirical data where rigid belief structures are lacking. This research translates directly into clinical utility. Establishing the persistence of consciousness could provide the framework for new therapies for grief and more informed approaches to end-of-life care, specifically addressing the documented anxiety of patients and their families. The standard scientific assumption operating today is materialism. In this model, physical brain processes generate consciousness, destroy the biological hardware, and the software stops running entirely. It maps out like this. Basic physics builds into chemistry, which builds into biology, psychology, and finally consciousness. The mind is an emergent property of the brain. The non-materialist alternative proposes a different relationship. Here, consciousness is an independent property of reality. The brain doesn't generate the mind. It acts as a biological filter or a receiver for it. If the receiver model is accurate, destroying the brain severs the local connection, but it leaves behind a floating variable, an independent consciousness that should theoretically persist. Testing this introduces the problem of unobservability. We only have direct access to our own conscious experience. It is inherently impossible to place a disembodied mind under a microscope to measure its properties. To gather data, researchers must look at boundary cases, specifically near-death and out-of-body experiences. These are moments where the physical hardware fails, but the software seemingly keeps recording. If consciousness persists after the body fails, the materialist assumption that the brain is the sole generator of the mind becomes an incomplete model. An out-of-body experience is defined as a measurable dislocation of the self from the physical body. Subjects consistently report an identical sensation, a sudden, elevated vantage point, looking down upon their own physical form, perceiving localized details they cannot biologically see. In 1980, researchers attempted to measure this dislocation. They worked with a subject named Alex Tanous, who demonstrated the ability to induce these states on demand. They asked Tanous to project his consciousness into a sealed chamber containing a target image. Highly sensitive kinetic sensors monitored the interior. The data showed statistically significant correlations between Tanous accurately identifying the target and simultaneous kinetic disturbances inside the sealed box. Similar boundary questions surround near-death experiences. Between 2008 and 2014, researchers conducted the AWARE study, tracking cardiac arrest patients across multiple hospitals. Survivors reported veridical awareness. They accurately described the room, the medical staff's precise actions, while their brains showed no activity. Yet even these findings fail to satisfy the scientific burden of proof for post-mortem survival. These boundary cases prove consciousness behaves strangely at the absolute edge of biological failure. They only provide data from the threshold. They do not deliver data from definitively beyond it. To bridge that gap, researchers analyze mental mediumship, cases where an individual claims to receive information directly from a deceased entity.
Academic research strictly isolates this from physical mediumship, like moving objects or manifesting ectoplasm, because historical contamination by fraud makes the data unreliable. Mental mediumship provides a clean, testable metric, information. But testing that information introduces the ultimate epistemological bottleneck. In parapsychology, it's known as the super psi, or living agent psi, hypothesis. The traditional survival model maps clearly. A medium receives information from a deceased entity, passing it to the living sitter. The super psi model severs this connection. Instead, the medium uses latent telepathy to intercept facts directly from the living sitter's memories. This creates an immediate deadlock. If a medium produces highly specific facts about a dead relative, how can you definitively prove they acquired it from a discarnate spirit, rather than simply reading the sitter's mind? The harsh reality for researchers is that the data output of successful mediumship is functionally indistinguishable from extreme telepathy between living people. To break the deadlock and isolate the variables, researchers at the Windbridge Research Center designed an experimental protocol specifically built to confront the super psi problem. Their primary strategy is multi-level blinding. By methodically stripping away all normal vectors of communication, they force the subject to rely exclusively on anomalous methods. First is physical blinding. The medium is completely isolated, never meeting or speaking to the person requesting the reading. Second is informational blinding. The proxy sitter interacting with the medium is kept entirely in the dark about the target. In a 2015 study, researchers generated transcripts of these heavily controlled readings. They gave the actual sitters 2 transcripts, their intended reading and a decoy intended for someone else, asking them to score the accuracy blindly. The sitters correctly identified their own readings, rating them significantly more accurate than the decoys, at a rate far exceeding random chance. The formal scientific classification for this validated data transfer is anomalous information reception, or AIR. But even under these extreme controls, AIR does not kill the super psi hypothesis. A telepathic medium could theoretically scan the distant sitter's mind, even if they've never met. We know impossible data is moving through the room. We have proven the transmission. We still cannot confirm the exact identity of the sender. To filter the source, researchers are turning to phenomenology, analyzing the internal, qualitative experience of the subjects doing the receiving. The logic here is straightforward. If telepathy and mediumship are truly different mechanisms, they should trigger different internal cognitive markers in the brain. Windbridge surveyed over 100 mediums who perform both psychic readings of the living and communications with the dead to map their internal states. The survey responses formed highly distinct data clusters. The cognitive traits associated with reading living targets separated clearly from the traits associated with contacting deceased targets. 96% of the participating mediums reported a clear, recognizable difference between the 2 operational states. This qualitative data directly challenges the super psi hypothesis. It suggests mediumship is a completely unique cognitive mode, operating on a different channel entirely. Phenomenology provides the strongest path forward. If we can't observe the signal directly, we must study the structural impact it has on the receiver. Incurable data strongly supports the reality of anomalous information reception. Subjects acquire accurate data under completely impossible conditions. The source of that data is the only remaining friction point. This brings us back to the core neuroscientific models. As the evidence for anomalous reception mounts, the strict assumption that the brain is the sole generator of the mind becomes an incomplete model. The data suggests the receiver model fits reality better. We are looking at an independent property of reality, a system where the physical hardware can turn to dust, but the mechanism continues to operate. Survival research functions as an empirical challenge to our current understanding of consciousness. If mind exists independently of biology, we are observing a fundamental property of reality that persists beyond its physical host.